Greetings once again. Welcome to our program tonight, to the Silence of Our Friends. That's right, the Silence of Our Friends. We are here streaming live, and I trust you are there. I trust that you'll take an opportunity to comment, take an opportunity to like, that's a thumbs up, or the use of any emoji of your choosing will really help us to uh, broaden our touch and our reach through the various means of social media. And so we appreciate you. I want to say hello to as many people as I can before we get into our program. But we are here. You are there. 6:30 p.m. is our goal. Central Standard Time on Monday evenings. Today is Monday, the 14th day of this 22nd year in this millennia. Today is Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day to all the ladies. Pastor Joanne Farrington is joining us. Connie Demand, Phyllis Jones, Beverly Thompson. Happy Valentine's Day to you. And of course, we send out a special Valentine's greetings to Pastor Jay, and we appreciate all that she has contributed to making me the person that I am and making our reach and our goals what they have been. So thank you, Pastor Jay. Happy Valentine's Day to you. Zadie Jones, a friend from McDonough, Georgia. Carolyn Banks is joining us. Thank you all. And I would take it that you are taking the time right now to share. If you're over on YouTube, please press the word share, and you have several choices with that selection. One, you can allow the YouTube selection to give you the opportunity to personate or designate the specific persons. You can copy the link and start your own thread via email from YouTube or via your iMessaging or your text messaging status on your device and start your own thread. That's three options. Thank you, Charles Turner, for coming in. Anita Jones, blessings to you. E. Hale is coming in. Abraham Smith, blessings to you. And also, if you're over on the Facebook side of the world, please, please, please take the time to help us to spread the gospel of this message of the reverse of silence. And if you're there, you can simply press the word share. This will post this presentation on your Facebook page, which is very easy to do. This means all of your followers will have an opportunity to see what it is we're offering here at The Silence and become partners or partakers with us if that's an element of their choice. So thank you all for doing that. You know, it's one thing to join us, which we appreciate 1,000 times over. It's quite another thing, on the other hand, for you to take the time to make sure that the message is getting out and that you are a partaker with that process by sharing. So thank you for not only viewing and participating with the comments, but thank you for also sharing on your page. Sharing, that's a way of not being silent. The share accounts for everything. So we may be down a few people immediately tonight because of it being Valentine's Day, but that's okay. We're here, and people can come back and watch the restream or catch it later via YouTube or the archives of Facebook. Thank you, Juanita Johnson, for joining us. Blessings to you and your family again. And I want you to type in the tag, or at least the topic for our discussion tonight. And I pray that it's worthy and worthwhile for the investment of your time. Um, on our various social media platforms, we launched the topic today earlier, and it was simply "Go Back to Africa?" ? What would have been lost if they did? In parentheses, the big question: what would have been lost if they did? But I'm going to give you the actual title. I want you to type it in, and it's in parentheses. The first word is in parentheses, Negroes, capital Negroes, closed parentheses, go back to Africa, colon, what would have been lost, and then in parentheses again, if they did. I'm going to give it to you again, and I'll know you're with me when I see you typing in the comments. Negroes, in parentheses, go back to Africa, semicolon, or excuse me, colon, what would have been lost, and then in open and close parentheses, if they did, question mark. This is part one. It's going to be a pretty broad subject, so it's going to take me until next week to close it out. In deference to African American History Month, Black History Month, which I consider to be Black, Bronze, and Brown Persons History Month in this very short month of February, February, as it's correctly pronounced. But we'll give it what we can. So I'm the egalitarian, Georgia Matthews II. It is my happy privilege to be with you. And by use of this term, egalitarian, it's the person who, by way of their thought process, by way of their actions and conduct, assert the equality of all people, that there is not a superior class. And just as that is true, there is not an inferior class, but all people are on equal footing from the vantage point of God Himself. Thank you, Connie, for coming in. So here we are. Quotes on silence. It was Albert Einstein who said, "If I remain silent, I'm guilty of complicity." You're just as guilty as the person who is actually doing the wrong if you are a person of silence. If you see wrong, if you have experienced wrong, if you see discrimination, racism, and for whatever reason you decide that you don't want to say something about it, do something about it, and everyone can do something on their level. Silence is not just verbal alone. Silence, the breaking of silence isn't verbal alone. It's also an action. It's also sometimes a repositioning. Sometimes it is the decision to come back with a later action. Thank you, Erlene Rogers. And so, again, let's move on because I have so much to deal with tonight. Remember, it was Jesus who told us that we are to be two things as the church, as His followers, to fulfill His assignment and His designation for our lives. Over in the book of St. Matthew, chapter 5, He says that the church, those who are called out to be followers of Jesus Christ from this world's system, are to, metaphorically speaking, serve as two things: A, salt of the earth; B, light of the world. Not in neither case did He commission us alone to be involved exclusively with merely the church and its functions and its protocols, but we're really assigned to a system, the system of the earth and the system of the world, and we are to be light to it and salt to it. Remember, light is the opposite, is the stronger opposite, if you will, not necessarily polar opposite, but the stronger opposite of darkness. In those emblematic words, light is revelation or having an understanding and an application of what should be done in a more correct functionality. Darkness is the opposite thereof. And then salt is both a preservative. Salt is also a seasoning. It's a chemical used to flavor. But not only that, salt is everywhere. It's in every facet of life. And so, thank you for typing that in. Charles, thank you. Thank you, Philip Thomas, for coming in. Bless you, sir. And thank you for listening. Thank you, Theresa Thomas is coming in. Pamela Dobbins is coming in. Thank you all for liking. Thank you all for sharing. Thank you all for sharing. Did I say thank you all for sharing? Thank you all for sharing. And it was Dr. King who makes several statements. I have a book, many books on Dr. King's life and his presence in the earth while he was here and the impact he made through 39 years of existence, really from age 25, and 14 years later, he was murdered on the balcony, second floor balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. It was Dr. King who said, "What will be remembered in the end will not be the words of our enemies." And we put so much stress on that, and so much attention, give so much attention to those words, the words of our enemies. But he says in the opposite, in the end, what will be remembered will be the silence of our friends. And then he says in another place, there's nothing in the world as dangerous or more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity, for those in the back of the room. And then I love this: when our lives begin to end, the day we become silent about things that matter. And here at the Silence, our aphorism, one of our favorite aphorisms is, speak the truth even if your voice shakes while doing so. It was Frederick Douglass, the former slave, later turned abolitionist and doctor of education, in my view, who said, knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. And I want you all to type in exactly, Charles, you got it right. Negroes, in parentheses, go back to Africa, colon, yes. What would have happened if they did? What would the world have lost had these Negroes, being referred to by this title, gone back to Africa? Thank you, Daniel Robinson, my friend from way back when. It's a blessing to see your name pop up on this roster of famous people. So thank you all for being with us tonight. And I have to make this clarification. Challenging racism does not make a person racist. And that's been a clever tool to keep people from delving in to this subject that has kept people of color, this particular demographic, crippled and mangled in some respects. The intermingling of the notion that addressing the subject, speaking the truth on a particular subject, makes you a partaker in the evil of that subject, such as racism. So, my answer to those people who would think that is that challenging racism does not make one a racist, though they are cleverly intertwined. That's another Georgism there, straight from the heart to you. We're not talking about a building where our subject matter has nothing to do with a religion or even people, but principles. We have to become people of principle. And when you deal with the subject of what is a principle and what do principled people look like, it's the answer to the question, what is right, not who is right. Thank you. Thank you. Happy Love Day to you. Thank you. You have it right, Anita Jones. Thank you for participating. Education on a subject makes room, makes allowances for the discomfort that the education brings on that subject matter. Whenever the light, or the learning lamp, which is the emblem for education here in America, the learning lamp of education is lit or lighted, it dispels darkness, and that dispelling of darkness makes room for the inconvenience or the discomfort that the education brings. And at the end of the day, the discomfort that arises from education is lesser than the light that education itself brings on any subject at any time. And so in America, the polls tell us that 62% of the persons who are citizens of these yet to be United States are people of Christian values. Now, that's a very broad term, but that information is what the statistics tell us. If that is true, and if the church is doing her job, that means that in all areas of the seven mountains of influence, we should see a 62% chance that some Christian response is rolled out and doled out. That means on the mountain of religion, we should see 62% of the time our religious institutions are discrimination free, and we don't see that at all. We have yet to see that, and the telling, it's been telling and even cryptic, the last election, general election cycle, when we saw the real hearts of our white evangelical shared evangelical brothers and sisters whom we love, but we saw that the hearts of people have not been greatly changed because they have embraced former president number 45, and I don't like to call names because I believe names give life even to evil. And we saw their embracing, we saw them switching off and making the choice of a greater sin. They said that the sin of abortion was greater or was lesser than the sin of lying and all the other things that this person was guilty of. Over 30,000 lies of record, and they could not separate themselves from that instinct and that notion only because he embraced racism, he embraced discrimination. So we did not see 62% of the of a light being shined even in religion. We saw religious leaders put their whole ministry, their whole entire lives on the line to support a man who was discriminatory in the lesser sense, uh, and just flat out racist in a greater sense. We talk about the world system. It encompasses the family mountain. It encompasses the mountain of education, the mountain of government, the arts, media, business, and economics. And so our scriptural support tonight, many people will say, George Matthews, you have no business dealing with this, even though I'm called to do so. I would give you a scriptural reference of support of our effort every time we come together. And the scriptural reference I like you to consider tonight is taken from St. Matthew chapter 21, verses 6 through 9 from the New Living Translation. And it says very simply, the two disciples did as Jesus commanded. They brought a donkey and the colt to him and threw their garments on the colt, and he, Jesus, sat on it. Most of the crowd spread their garments on the road ahead of him, Jesus, referring to Jesus, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. Jesus, verse 9, was in the center of the procession, and the people around him were shouting, "Praise God for the Son of David. Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Praise God in the highest." The reason that I'm using this particular scripture is that in the midst of a Roman controlled world, which Jesus' ministry had its birth, its longevity and height in. Jesus was crucified on a Roman constructed cross. Crucifixion itself was a Roman torture filled manner of death, and then torture before death. But in the midst of that world, Jesus rode in the middle of Jerusalem on a donkey, which symbolized a political procession. It's what the Romans did every time they conquered. The king or one of his generals would ride through town. They would drag or have tied behind them the king of the town or the township or the city they conquered, and they would mock him with a procession, processional. And Jesus took part in this to display that he was the king of a new kingdom in the midst of a crooked and perverse king that was in authority in his world, which means that Jesus' life, characterized by his death, was in a slap in the face of a wrong political system. He took a stand, and even at his death, the processional that he rode into Jerusalem on and out of Jerusalem bespoke of the fact that he was making a statement that he was a king of another system. And we as the church are supposed to be making a statement in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. So this statement that I made tonight, the topic that I asked you to type in if you did, Negroes go back to Africa. Negroes is in parentheses, and then colon, that's the two dots atop each other. What would have been lost if they did part one? So when I use this statement, go back to Africa, it is not to be confused with the Marcus Garvey Back to Africa movement. Okay, those are two different things. Now, this is a cadence that was shouted out publicly to discourage the advancements of people of color during the civil rights movement, when integration was happening. Many of the sit-ins at counters, at bus stations, you would see on the signs, "Go back to Africa," or it would have the N word rather than Negro, the other N word. um, at various marches, whatever have you, would see it on the signs, and you would hear our white brothers and sisters, many of whom would shout this statement, "Go back to Africa," and it would be prefaced with the N word. And I'm just using the word Negroes so that you could get the full inference of where we're going tonight. Now, let's just talk a word about Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey lived, and this is not the statement to be confused with the Back to Africa movement, but I just seized this as an opportunity to talk about Marcus Garvey. 1887 to 1940 was his timeline. Born in Jamaica, 1887, founded his Universal Negro Improvement Association, otherwise known as UNIA, in 1914. The UNIA stressed racial pride and self improvement, much like the views of educator Booker T. Washington, whom Garvey admired. Garvey, however, had greater international ambitions, including the development of a worldwide black owned industry and shipping lines. He also called for the end of white colonial rule in Africa. At the invitation of Booker T. Washington, at this invitation, Garvey traveled to the United States in 1916. He soon established his UNIA in New York City, opened a restaurant, and started a newspaper. In 1919, he formed the Black Star Line. Listen to this, the first black owned shipping company in the United States. Now, just think of it now. This is 1919. The Civil War ended in 1865. So this is about 50 years later or so. After slavery has been abolished in America, here this Jamaica born man is invited to these yet to be United States by Booker T. Washington, who alone made over 300 millionaires, made over 300 former slaves or descendants of slaves millionaires. We'll get to him one day. He's a fascinating study. Anyway, the publicity over the Black Star Line caused great excitement among Black Americans, many of whom bought stock in it. There was a togetherness. Garvey organized huge parades to promote this and other UNIA projects. He often appeared in colorful uniform, and you could Google him or do a research on him and search engine and place his name there, and you'll see he's mostly garbed in some military type regalia, uh, colorful uniform, wearing a plumed hat. In 1920, more than 20,000, catch this now, in 1920, the roaring 20s, more than 20,000 people attended Garvey's first UNIA convention in New York. The convention produced a Declaration of Negro Rights, which denounced lynchings, which, okay, we'll talk about that another time, segregated public transportation, job discrimination, and inferior black public schools. The document also demanded Africa for Africans. Without actually consulting any African people, the convention proclaimed Garvey the, quote, provisional president of Africa, end quote. Garvey believed that white society would never accept black Americans as equals. I'll read that again. Garvey believed that the white society would never accept black Americans as equals. And that's where we are here tonight to talk about what it is that discrimination actually involves, which is, and racism, uh, which really at its heart seeks to um, speak pejoratively and limit in a limiting sense of Africans or black, bronze, and brown people as it relates to their white counterparts. To have an inferior class while yet maintaining a superior class out of which black, bronze, and people are taken, are not included. So Garvey believed that white society would never accept black Americans as equals. Therefore, he called for the separate development of African Americans within the United States. The UNIA set up many small black owned businesses such as restaurants, groceries, grocery stores, a publishing house, and even a toy company that made black dolls. Garvey's goal was to create a separate economy and society run for and by African Americans. Ultimately, Garvey argued that all black people in the world should return to their homeland in Africa, which should be free of white colonial rule. Garvey had grand plans for settling black Americans in Liberia, the only country in Africa governed by Africans. But Garvey's UNIA lacked the necessary funds and funding, and few blacks in the United States indicated any interest in going back to Africa. So I wanted to be clear with that. So the question is that's on the floor, and I'm going to give you some pictures in just a minute. I'm going to answer this question with a short answer. Okay, Negroes go back to Africa. Colon, what would have been lost if they did? Part one. So I'm going to give you a few pictures or and in a short form, give you a bit of a homily on some persons who were principal agents in affecting education and the benefits of education in these yet to be United States that would have been lost if these Negroes had gone back to Africa. Now, this is not to say, and there have been some racist statements made by our white counterparts who said that their forefathers actually did we black, bronze, and brown people a favor by extracting us from Africa, in that they incite that in Africa we were merely uh, tribal people who were pygmies in that sense, and uneducated, undereducated, just cannibals and people of lesser mentalities. And so, in bringing the slaves, extracting us from Mother Africa, their contention is they actually did us a favor. We were able to learn about their religion in their words, to learn their language, and to come to a place that ultimately we would work for them. But that was all better than remaining in Africa and being the ignoramuses that we were. None of which is true, but that this is not to support that felonious mindset. But to answer the question here, what would have been lost if these Negroes had gone back to Africa? The short answer is many contributions. Um, let's deal with some of the pictures we have. The first of which, let's see, you're going to have, I think, Daniel Hale Williams. Daniel Hale Williams founded the first interracial hospital in America in 1891. Not the first hospital, but the first, catch it now, interracial hospital in 1891. Okay. Just, was it 26 years after slavery in America had been outlawed? This hospital served as the first school for black nurses in the country. So, had these Negroes gone back to Africa, then the country never would have had, or at least it would have been a longer time coming, the first interracial hospital in these yet to be United States, because in 1891 he founded it. Let's go to the next one, Kelly Miller. Kelly Miller. Miller was the country's first African American grad student in mathematics. Okay, so first of all, that's a credit to the race. And the reason that I'm giving you these examples is because, and I'm going to talk about it in just 1 minute's time, many people would tell you that Negroes should have been, after the abolition, after they've used our parentage, who were slaves and sharecroppers. After that, once there was no more economic value in these black, bronze, and brown bodies. These persons said, let them just go back to Africa. My contention is there would have been many contributions lost, and at the midst of this discussion that I'm having with you tonight, many people would tell you that there were no contributions of black, bronze, and brown people. We were worthless to this culture, and as a consequence, we should have been sent back to Africa, because we made no contributions. And the education system, and this is why I'm attacking this one firstly, because the education system in America, this yet to be United States, has been set up to imply indirectly, if not directly, that people of color have made no contributions. And this is okay. We're going to get to more of that. But anyway, Kelly Miller was the country's first African American grad student in mathematics. Later in life, as a prominent voice for civil rights in the early 1900s, he wrote articles in leading academic journals pushing for higher learning so that strong black leaders could be created. In other words, we would not have ever had the benefit of leadership in this country that was representative of the black, bronze, and brown demographic. Let's talk about Fannie C. Williams. Fannie C. Williams. Fannie C. Williams was a trailblazer in her nearly 60-year career as an educator. Thank God for African black, bronze, and brown educators who helped to tell our story. And I'm trying to unearth some people that you've not heard about in the typical black history month of February. Williams was a trailblazer in her nearly 60-year career as an educator. She was the driving force behind the passing of the Child Health Day in 1928. And she instituted kindergarten, kindergarten, and standardized testing for students across the board long before Louisiana as a state required it. So the country would have missed out on that. She instituted the concept of kindergarten, that education that prepares children for the first grade was the brainchild of a woman of color. And had she gone back to Africa, the country would have been minus this contribution. Let's talk about Benjamin Banneker. We've heard of him before. Benjamin Banneker, almost 100 years before the Department of Education was created, Banneker proposed in a critically acclaimed almanac that a secretary be appointed with power to establish and maintain free schools in every city, village, and township within the United States. So this is amazing that this man of color, who was the father of, some would say, the clock or the timepiece, the measurement of the city of Philadelphia, the farmer's almanac, which black, bronze, brown people used, but before it was ever used, the almanac I'm speaking of now, by people of color, the plantation owners and people who had crops used the almanac, of which Banneker was the father of, in that sense. But along with that, he was credited with having the foresight to say uh, schools need to be in every city for every person. Let's talk about Fannie Jackson Coppin, Coppin, Fannie Jackson Coppin. We're just talking about a few educational contributions that we know little of in this country. The country's first female African American principal. So she brought principalship in education or in public schools as a credit to our people. But not only that, this shifted um, the understanding to other people who are not of our particular culture that people of color are credible in terms of being able to not only achieve education themselves, but then secondly, to teach education, which is very important. We're going to get to it in a minute's time, hopefully. But then thirdly, augment leadership in education, primarily in this case, principalship. Fannie Jackson Coppin served 37 years and instituted many improvements in education in Philadelphia and elsewhere. Contribution next. John Wesley Gilbert, the first Black archaeologist. That's right, archaeologist. Gilbert influenced academia by strongly encouraging Blacks to record and publish their own histories. Know little or nothing about him, but there we are, uh, coming out of, if you will, slavery and post slavery, the records of Black, Browns, and Brown people were very jaded at best, very limited as far as the information. But here rises up this person who now allows a system and has the brain power to credibly create a system where people could track their roots, ancestral roots, if you will. How is that a credit to all people? Well, it's important for people as people are assimilating. There's going to be intermarrying and interrelating, and by that I mean the mixing of races. And if you are not able to trace your heritage, sometimes there are diseases, there are the communication of the blood, chemical imbalances, and so forth and so on. Yes, I'm getting to that, Teresa Thomas. You see where I'm going. She says this is why there's resistance to critical race history, and it's really that's a better phrase for it. Covering, it's referred to as critical race theory in most people's minds. And there's a great debate, great fights going on across this country, but it's really critical race history. It's critical for us to be able to teach history, the truth about it as it was. They do not want the truth to be known because when people are undervalued, marginalized, they are underappreciated. And so, craftily, cleverly, the truth has been concealed in education because everybody comes through some sort of educational system in this country. And if you keep the knowledge of the truth away from a certain demographic of people, then it's easier to tell them because they made no contributions, they are worthless. And this is why they raised the standard of saying after slavery, after the economic exploitation of Black, bronze, and brown bodies, go back to Africa. You were only good for what you did in the fields, and that's just not true. I'm running out of time for this program tonight, but let's get in as much as we can. Then Dorothy Lavinia, Lavinia, Dorothy Lavinia Brown. In a historic first, Dr. Brown became the first African American female surgeon. So I happen to know and have it on a good source of authority that when you are conducting surgeries, you don't check for pigmentation, coloration, melanin, or the lack thereof. In other words, you perform surgical procedures on whoever comes up as a patient. So that would have been lost had we sent all the Negroes to Africa, perhaps not her, but her parentage or parents of her parents, or so forth and so on. She served. Dr. Brown became the first African American female surgeon in the South in 1954 and was later the first Black woman on the Tennessee legislature. Let's talk about Nathan Hare, Hare. The first university Black studies program in the country was directed by Hare. And when his administration attempted to cut the program by half, He protested with students for 5 months. Why is that a benefit to all peoples, not just black, bronze, and brown people? Well, I happen to have it on a good source of authority because I'm a recipient of this information when I attended a probably 90% white university of a place of higher learning. It was through the Department of Education, the system of African American studies, that I began to learn at least part truths that my ears had never heard and my brain had never conjugated about the history of African Americans or Africans while in America, the extraction stories, the Middle Passage, the heinous treatment on ships, the egregious wrongs of enslavement, Jim Crowism, some things I wasn't taught. And I had a pretty decent education. One of the, well, let's just leave it at that. And then finally, Aaron Lloyd Dixon. Aaron Lloyd Dixon. Dixon's contribution to academia came in the form of a program called, wait for it, for people in the back of the room, free breakfast for school children, not just black, bronze, or brown school children, because I happen to know that even to date, black, bronze, and brown people only represent about 13, 14, maybe as high as 15% of the national population of these yet to be United States. There are many more white people on government assisted programs, free lunch programs, Section 8 housing. It has to be because they're 62, 68% of the population. And the other races, smaller races, fill in the gaps between the 15% and the 68%. I've done programs on that, and you've heard me talk about that. So when this program called Free Breakfast for School Children, which he helped launch as the founding member of Seattle's Black Panther chapter, and there's a fascinating study on Aaron Lloyd Dixon and the free lunch program that was launched into reality by the Black Panthers. Started with black children who were being overlooked as far as breakfast was concerned because of impoverished situations. But man, the free lunch program is all over the country now. So contributions have been made. So let's talk about this from black slavery to the segregation of Jim Crow to systematic discrimination and inequality to our or the systematic discrimination and inequality of our current day. One theme has been consistent. This is my uh, premise. One theme has been consistent: to keep people of color marginalized. Um, Quote, and this is my personal quote: how do you keep people of color marginalized? And here it is: they have made no significant contributions because they are, if no if not no, or lesser value compared to their white counterparts. In other words, to keep this seed flowing in the minds of black, bronze, and brown people that you've made no contribution since you've been here since 1619 with the extraction of the first 20 and some odd from Africa to these yet to be United States, 13, 14, 13 colonies. For over 400 years now, you've been here and you've made no contribution. The best contribution you made to this country's building, it was economic for the white plantation owners, in that you were slaves that worked the fields, and that was your greatest contribution. And that seed will produce a tree in the minds of those who believe it, of worthlessness or being of lesser value. Of lesser value. That brings to mind the word marginalization. To bring down in the mindset, to lessen in the mindset the capabilities of people of color. And this is this consistent theme. Yes, I agree, Connie Demand. Thank God for the excellent minds of black, bronze, and brown people during their lifetime of contributions. Yes, I agree, Theresa Thomas. Nobody has taught the story of the contributions of African Americans until Carter G. Woodson started Black History Week, which Black History Month evolved from in 1926. Now, please hear this. The U.S. economy was built on the exploitation and occupational segregation of people of color. See, segregation and then occupational segregation or segregation, which was racist in its concept. In other words, to have separate water fountains, to have a taller water fountain for white people, clean, and a smaller water fountain for black people that was dirty, that was never cleaned, sent a message: inferiority versus superiority. To have separate restrooms in public places, white restrooms, clean, debris free, inside, but the black restrooms around the back in the corner alley, if they had them at all, left them open. Anybody could come in and use them. Uh, Whatever happened, happened. Sometimes, in some instances, there were not even private stalls, so you just had to go in and expose yourself like you were living in prison. But it sent a message. That was bad enough. The physical was bad enough. The literal was bad enough, but the psychological was what they were really after. By segregation, I'm able to elevate one class while at the same time I'm demoralizing another class. And I was reading some of the comments after we closed last week's program, and just Zadie Jones was sharing an experience of having seen something in the state, I think it was Mississippi, I can recall, of the separation of restrooms. And while the actual lettering was taken off, the stencil behind the lettering was still layered there, so people could see this this message, and it still harbors in the hearts of people today. But watch this now. Not only segregation in a physical, literal sense, but then that segregation was the foundation for something else called occupational segregation of people of color. While many government policies and institutional practices helped create this system, the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and the New Deal, as well as the limited funding and scope of anti discrimination agencies, are some of the biggest contributions to inequality in America today or to date. Uh, Together, these policies decisions concentrated workers of color in chronically undervalued occupations, institutionalized racial disparities in wages and benefits, and perpetuated employment discrimination. It was intentional, because if we can't keep you enslaved by chains and legally, now we're going to do it psychologically and emotionally. And according, as we did the programs on the Willie Lynch letters, this system will perpetuate itself for 300 to 400 years. And he was a prophet of an ill and corrupted system. As a result, stark and persistent racial disparities exist in jobs, wages, benefits, and almost every other measure of economic well being. According to this website, AmericanProgress.org, August 7th, 2019, systematic inequality and economic opportunity. Slavery and Jim Crow concentrated workers of color in chronically undervalued occupations. It was intentional to give you lesser employment after releasing your forebears from slavery, without transportation, the mule, without land 40 acres without any kind of provision, only to trap you into coming back to be working on the same plantations in many instances as a sharecropper, which is we've done the programs on that as well, or remaining back, reverting back to being owned by the same slave owner you were liberated from, if you'll excuse the preposition at the end. Um, or even just relegating people to lower occupations. um, for centuries, black people were enslaved and forced to work in brutal conditions as agricultural, domestic, and service workers. Okay. Now, this post slavery, but watch this figure. You're going to wait for this one now. By some estimates, slave holders, that means plantation owners, slave owners, extracted, took, exploited, if you will, more than 14 trillion, not million with the letter M, not billion with the capital letter B, but trillion with the capital letter T. $14 trillion worth of labor in today's dollars from their captives. This means, this is sad, black, bronze, and brown people built this country and had little or nothing to show for it and were relegated to undervalued occupations to keep them restrained in their mindsets. Enslaved people plowed, sowed fields, harvested, packaged crops, raised, milked, and butchered livestock, even after being freed from slavery, relegate them to lower tasks, menial tasks, to keep them enslaved in their minds, separated from the superior or master, alleged master classes in their minds. But watch this. They cooked and served food, cleaned houses, weaved and mended clothing, and provided child care services. They cut hair, carried luggage, and drove wagons, carts, and carriages. When enslaved black people attempted to flee, federal laws such as the 1793 and 1850 Fugitive Slave Acts helped ensure their recapture by fining officials who did not arrest alleged runaways and imprisoning anyone who aided in their escape. If captured, enslaved people could be tortured, mutilated, and even killed without legal repercussions. The United States abolished slavery in 1863, but this action did not coincide with the opening of all occupations to liberated black workers. On the contrary, federal officials within the Freedmen's Bureau, this is the bureau that had the legislation or the authority over these newly freed black slaves, established the federal government in part to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, encouraged black people to stay in the South and enter into contracts. The Freedmen's Bureau now, which was supposed to give every opportunity to these slaves to recoup all of their losses, all of their parents' losses and grandparents' losses. But instead, they encouraged black people, though recently freed from slavery, to stay in the South and enter into contracts doing the same work for the families that previously enslaved them. Amazing. After Reconstruction, state and local governments doubled down on these efforts by enacting Jim Crow laws, which codified the role of black people in the Southern economy and society. States such as South Carolina enacted strict black codes that fined black people if they worked in any occupation other than farming or domestic servitude. Keep it in their minds that you're free in one sense of wording, but in your mind, you're of lesser value than the superior class. You will always be our slaves in some facet or another. If they broke these laws or abandoned their jobs after signing a labor contract with, in some instances, the same slave owners who purchased them, they could be arrested, and thanks to a loophole in the 13th Amendment, and I've done programs on this, forced back into unpaid labor on white plantations. Lawmakers also sought to prevent black people from migrating to the North, that is, in search of safety and economic opportunity. They enacted immigrant agent laws restricting interstate labor recruiters from encouraging or financing the relocation of black workers or from posting advertisements in predominantly black communities for distant, mostly in the North, job openings. During the mid 20th century, technical advancements reduced the demand for farm labor and domestic work in the South. These changes, combined with discriminatory U.S. Department of Agriculture policies, rampant lynchings of black, bronze, and brown necks on trees, and KKK or Ku Klux Klan terror led thousands of black households in the South to flee north. As a result, the United States experienced a rapid decline in the number of black farm operators and farm and domestic workers. However, black workers remained overrepresented in low wage service jobs. Meanwhile, they continued devaluation of domestic and agricultural vocations, and the accompanying search for lower wage laborers of color soon led to a high concentration, wait for it, of Asian American and Latino workers in domestic and agricultural occupations. This remains true today. Occupational segregation and the persistent devaluation of workers of color are a direct result of intentional government policy. To this day, people of color remained overrepresented in the lowest paid agricultural, domestic, and service vocations, while Black or African American, Asian, and Hispanic or Latino people comprise 36% of the overall U.S. workforce. They constitute 58% of miscellaneous agricultural workers, 70% of maids and housekeeping cleaners, and 74% of baggage porters, bellhops, and concierges. Slavery and Jim Crow devalued these types of work, and the legacy of these institutions continues to inform the American economic system and its outcomes. Now, the point is, if these Negroes had been relegated back to Africa, the system that tried to keep them limited, bound by giving inferior opportunities for vocational work, so to speak, uh, the country would have suffered again. Where would the country have been without these Negroes who constituted 70% of maids, housekeepers, and cleaners, 74% of baggage porters, bellhops, and concierges? Um, what would have happened to the country? See, you, to keep a man down, the old adage is still true. You have to stay with him to keep your foot on his neck. So the country would have, and still is, in my opinion, uh, experiencing the less than success that it could experience because of its racist foundation, and nobody is talking about it. Um, the point is, we have this education system. CRT fought large and strong, particularly in this state by current Governor Kay Ivey. And I think this is just an irony um, because she herself, a Republican from Alabama, is an educator. She was a teacher for many years before rising to political, so to speak, prominence. An educator herself. I wonder what she's been teaching her students all these years, her black students about themselves, brown students about themselves, bronze students about themselves, as compared to white students about themselves. I wonder what her ideology has been regarding inferior classes of people versus the superior alleged class, quote end quote. Her exclusionary politics of black, bronze, and brown people make me suspect that in the classroom she was doing the same thing. She has various television commercials now supporting her, or at least uh, in deference to her bid for reelection for governor, that outright say no critical race theory or better history in America. Excuse me, in Alabama. This is crazy. No critical race theory or history in Alabama, which means that this is her mindset. Um, Native Americans, we were taught, were the enemy of the Western cowboy. Um, Programs like, any of those cowboy programs that predate me, but my mother sure loved those Westerns. But, with that said, it was crazy to me to discover that the Western cowboy was really taking authority to reinforce the killing of the Native Americans who uh, who belonged to this country and who the country of the North American continent belonged. They were stealing it from them and killing them to take it, and then taught us that the Native American Indian was the enemy to the Americans. Amazing. But when you are in control of education, you can do what you want to do. And that's what critical race theory would take a stance against. You wouldn't be able to be a revisionist or to revise history and make it what you want. But these people are have revisionist mindsets. They want to make history what they want it to be, paint the picture as they want it, instead of allowing history to be taught as it happened, as it occurred. Um, if there is a master race, and remember I talked about this last week, which alludes to a people held to be racially preeminent based on the hue or the coloration of their skin. The darker hued or colored people are on the bottom of this totem pole or pecking order. And of course, the whiter the skin pigmentation, the more apt, the more intellectual, the more superior those persons are supposed to be. So this gave them the mindset that they were more fit to rule over the inferior or enslave other classes. Uh, I want to show you a picture of Ruby Bridges. We talk about we talk about oh man, the heinousness of miseducation. Ruby Bridges, whose person's picture you're about to see now, was the first to integrate an all white school in the South, we're told. At the tender age, listen to this, at the tender age of 6, that's the number after 5, Ruby Bridges advanced the cause of civil rights in November 1960. 1960, now 100 years after slavery was abolished. By the ending of the Civil War, by the winning of the North versus the South, the Army of America versus the Confederate States of the South. 1960. Okay. So all this time since slavery was abolished, black, bronze, and brown people, in a sense, were relegated to an inferior education, and that was intentional and clever to keep certain subjects from arising to the level of truth in their minds, so that they would always be taught that they were nothing, never amounted to anything, never contributed anything, because he who controls education dictates what the pupil from that education will think. Consequence was that you had inferior school buildings, I'm told. You had inferior literature. The books were secondhand after the white students did everything they wanted to do to them. Then those books were passed on to black schools. Black schools had only black teachers, the benefit of that was those teachers knew that education, along with Jesus, was the way out of a corrupt system. So forth and so on. Let's just try to end this. She became the first African American student to integrate an elementary school in the South. Born on September 8th, 1954, Bridges, we're talking about contributions now in education. This would have been lost had these Negroes or their parents or the parents of their parents been sent back to Africa after they had been exploited, and $14 trillion worth of exploitation economically that built this country would have been extracted, and then the people sent back to the continent with literally nothing to pay for it or to show for it. Bridges was the eldest of five children for Lucille and Abon Bridges, farmers in Tylertown, Mississippi. When Ruby was 2 years old, her parents moved their family to New Orleans, otherwise known as New Orleans, Louisiana, in search of better work opportunities. Ruby's birth year coincided with the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark ruling Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, which ended racial segregation in public schools. Nonetheless, Southern states continued to resist integration, and in 1959, Ruby attended a segregated New Orleans kindergarten. A year later, however, a federal court ordered Louisiana to desegregate. The school district created entrance exams for African American students to see whether they could compete academically at the all white school. Hear this: Ruby and five other students flat passed the exam. Her parents, which were torn about whether to let her attend the all white William Frantz Elementary School a few blocks from their home, her father resisted, fearing for his daughter's safety. Her mother, however, wanted Ruby to have the educational opportunities that her parents themselves had been denied, of which they had been denied. Meanwhile, the school district dragged its feet, delaying her admittance until November 14th. Two other students decided not to leave their school at all. The other three were sent to an all white McDonough Elementary School. I'm coming to an end. Stay with me. Ruby and her mother were escorted by four federal marshals to the school every day that year. I can't imagine what kind of emotional pressure that was. You're 6 years of age, and you have the howlings, the uh, verbal assaults from the white population to such a degree that federal marshals have to walk you into the school, and you're only 6 years of age. Amazing. But listen to this. Um, she walked past crowds screaming vicious slurs at her. Undeterred, she later said she only became frightened when she saw a woman holding a black baby doll in a coffin. She spent her first day in the principal's office due to the chaos created as angry white parents pulled their children from school. Ardent segregationists withdrew their children permanently. Barbara Henry, a white Boston native, was the only teacher willing, she's from the North, willing to accept Ruby, and all year she was a class of one, but brave, but brave. Ruby ate lunch alone, 6 years of age now, and sometimes played with her teacher at recess, but she never missed a day of school that year. While some families supported her bravery, and some Northerners sent money to aid her family, others protested throughout the city. The Bridges family suffered for their courage. Abon, the father, lost his job, and grocery stores refused to sell Lucille, her mother, sell to her mother, Lucille. Her sharecropping grandparents were evicted from the farm where they had lived for a quarter century, 25 years of sharecropping. But you see, the pressure was placed on them to get back in your class, get back in your box, get back in the cage, literally, uh, from an emotional, psychological standpoint. Notice this. Over time, the other African American students enrolled many years later. Ruby's four nieces would also attend. In 1964, artist Norman Rockwell celebrated her courage with a painting of that first day entitled The Problem We All Live With. Ruby graduated from a desegregated high school, became a travel agent, married, and had four sons. She was reunited with her first teacher in the mid 1990s, and for a time, the pair did speaking engagements together. Ruby later wrote about her early experiences in two books and received the Carter G. Woodson Book Award. A lifelong activist for racial equality, in 1999, Ruby established the Ruby Bridges Foundation to promote tolerance and create change through education. In 2000, she was made an honorary deputy marshal in a ceremony in Washington, D.C. Um, so let's just, I'll show you this last picture and I'm over time. Um, During the Reconstruction era, and I want you to see this picture of Tolson's Chapel School. During the Reconstruction era, African Americans in the former slaveholding states saw education as an important step towards achieving equality, independence, and prosperity. As a result, they found ways to learn despite the many obstacles that poverty and white people placed in their path. African Americans' commitment to education had lasting effects on the former slaveholding states. As voters and legislators, they played crucial roles in creating public schools for blacks and whites in southern and border states in the late 1800s. Now, if you're looking at this chapel, this is Tolson's Chapel School in Sharpsburg, Maryland. A small church known as Tolson's Chapel was at the center of local blacks, with an apostrophe S, efforts to educate themselves and their children. African American Methodists built Tolson's Chapel in 1866. Now remember, the Civil War ended in 1865. So that next year, within months of the ending of the Civil War, these black, bronze, and brown people are building a church that doubles as a school. Important point. This modest building near the site of the Civil War Battle of Antietam, 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 served as both a church and a school. The history of the schools housed in Tolson's Chapel illustrates how African Americans across the former slaveholding states created and sustained schools during Reconstruction. All right, I'll just give you one action agenda question. One question because I'm over time. Yes, Lord have mercy. Ruby Bridges did it. Every time I read her story and digging through the research to get there, it caused me to tear up because I just couldn't fathom in my mind, number one, the ignorance um, of another class of people to take this kind of hatred out on a child. And then number two, the child's courage to stand strong. If these Negroes had been sent back to Africa, then the integration through education would never have happened, and the opportunity of our racist and discriminatory brothers and sisters would never have happened for them to learn that their are people who do not look like them, but are people of equal value just the same. That's important. So, what did others, by their restrictions of education, please hear this question. What did others, by their restrictions and their fight of education, know about people of color that only a relative few have escaped by this knowledge? In other words, I've discovered that when people fight a thing like voter suppression, voting must be important. Uh, what is it? Literacy, being able to teach people to read and write as slaves was illegal. It must have been important. There must have been some truths hidden in education that the white class knew would be true if people of color were brought on an even playing field by being educated. What were some of those things that these people who escaped the limited education and educated themselves by building institutions of higher learning, by building schools, they knew something. They knew that something would happen if we took the time to educate ourselves. So I want you to just ponder, because remember, history is one thing, but knowing the history and then allowing the history to move us to places of action is something else. I have two other questions that are just really heavy, but maybe I'll bring them together next week. What was the master key of being able to rise educationally, politically, religiously, etc.? So shortly after the abolition of slavery, within the context of meager means, how did these people do it? How do these people do it? How did they build institutions of higher learning and institutions of education? Is this key the same today? Whatever the key is, what can you do creatively within the same context to make small advances towards being and seeing the light? As was the case with Tolson's chapel, the church was the epicenter of change for a people. They taught it and they modeled it. How did we shift from this working diagram, this diagram of teaching and modeling as the church, the impacts for elevation of a people who have been low rated for over 400 years? The model was the buildings housed the mechanics of change, while the people slash members obviously bought into the idea. Let me close tonight, and I apologize for keeping a little bit over. Business philosopher Jim Rohn makes this statement: sincerity is not a true test of truth, or test of truth. We must not make this mistake. He must be right. He's so sincere. It is possible to be sincerely wrong. We can only judge truth by truth and sincerity by sincerity. Just as there is a time to keep silent, there is also a time to speak truth. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 7. We cannot afford to be silent any longer from our various platforms of influence. Silence is, some would say, golden. To them, I would say, only until one's family and or relatives are negatively affected by wrongdoing. Others would say silence is great. To them, I would say, until someone's voice is necessary to save your life or corroborate your innocence. Silence is, hear my Georgisms, compromise. Silence is complicity with erroneous thinking. Silence is agreement with sanitized history. Silence is co-signing with control, racist, bigoted, and supremacy mentalities. Silence is equity and fairness in reverse. Silence robs supremacy of ever hearing truth and having the opportunity to change. Silence is the voice of continuous ethnic mistreatment. Silence validates inferior treatment. Silence is the approval of being objectified and maligned. Silence is often mistaken for agreement and consent. Silence is the devastation of a child being uncontrolled, untrained, and undisciplined by its silent parents. Silence is one level of maintaining and perpetuating cloaked ignorance. Silence is the ostrich syndrome. Black, bronze, and brown children must know how to correctly respond to racism, which they can only know when we are not silent. Liberty and justice and the hope of equality end with our silence. Until next Monday, 6:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, I bid you Godspeed and thank you for your time. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your interaction. I'll stay here a few minutes later behind the show or the program to see your comments, and I appreciate you so very much for your contributions as well as your time. Until next week, remember, we cannot afford to be silent ever again. Blessings and peace.